And for more on Russia's economic challenges and the outlook for the coming year, we're joined by Charles Ortel. He's a managing director at Newport Value Partners. Charles, good to have you back with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
Well, Charles, Russia's President Vladimir Putin says that the economy has hit bottom now and that it is set to make a comeback in 2016. Now, keeping in mind that for November, GDP was down 4% year over year, and oil prices are back below $40 a barrel. How realistic is this?
Well, I'd just say that on this one, he's playing the optimist because his economy is still so heavily tied to energy. Energy is affected negatively around the world. He'd have to believe that sanctions might be lifted soon to think that the economy would come back in 2016. So I just respectfully disagree with him. Well,
oil, of course, is the big deal here. The budget for 2016, Russia's budget, has oil in at $50 a barrel. As we know, it's hovering around 37. Right. What would it take to get oil back up to a stable 45 at least?
Well, I think looking around the world, there's no solid case for an economic revival that would lead to lessening the gap between supply and demand. So sadly, the only reason that oil prices might go up would be if there were a diabolical negative set of factors affecting the Middle East, say, an awful terrorist attack or an escalation of hostilities. So I think for the foreseeable future, you're looking at soft oil prices everywhere, and I think he's wrong.
And factoring in that Iran could be joining the oil exporting game as well, with its sanctions being lifted.
Exactly.
All right, well, speaking of sanctions, last year Western sanctions were imposed on Russia for its actions in Crimea. How detrimental have those sanctions been to Russia's economy?
They certainly haven't helped Russia's economy, but thinking about, have they actually changed his behavior? I don't think they've changed his behavior either. So it hasn't been good for Russia, but it hasn't necessarily served the West's interests either.
It hasn't served the West. In fact, one could say that it's actually hurt the EU a lot as well. The European Union dependent on Russia as a big export market, and of course for oil and gas. Charles, we've got the situation now where President Putin has positioned himself as a big fighting force against ISIS, against Islamic terrorism. As we know, Europe has been very impacted by this. These sanctions are up for extension in January. Does Europe have the will to extend these sanctions, particularly now with Islamic terrorism being a threat? What's a bigger threat here, Islamic terrorism or Russian imperialism from the EU's point of view?
I would have to think, coming off the disasters recently in Paris, that the Islamic terrorist threat looms very large in the minds of most of the key leaders in Europe, particularly, for example, David Cameron, who recently has come out front and publicly really disagreed with Barack Obama's strategy with regard to ISIS. So I think the Europeans fear ISIS more than they care about, for the moment, sadly, what happened in Ukraine.
So do you think that they'll extend the sanctions, or do you think we may see them not have the will to do so?
I would bet on balance that they don't have the will to do so. I think that, there's a lot of negative destabilizing forces throughout the Middle East, and I think what's going on there will rise to the attention of leaders in the West.
How do Russia's relations with Turkey factor in here?
Well, I think that Russia is, for the moment, extremely upset with Turkey for many reasons. On the one hand, they are upset over the downing of their plane. On the other hand, they're upset with the news that perhaps the Turks have not exactly been honest with the West in what they're doing, allowing ISIS to flourish. So I think they're upset over that. And I also think that they see as an objective, that is to say, Russia sees as an objective, prizing Turkey out of the West, which you might be able to do if you were to topple Erdogan.
Back to Vladimir Putin's projections for his economy. There are some good things going for the Russian economy. Inflation is coming off highs of nearly 16%. It's expected to fall 7%. And actually, Russian equity ETFs have outperformed all other emerging market ETFs. What are some of the positives for Russia's economy?
I think if you look eastward and you consider that Russia has really been hitching its economic stars to the east, to China, to India, to supply energy for the long run, and you consider the amount of infrastructure that would have to be put in place to do that effectively, Russian construction companies really have the upper edge as contrasted with Western European, and Americans are not really going to build that infrastructure out. So if you're looking really long term, 5, 10, 15 years out, then there are some plays that could make sense from a Russian platform. but you have to be brave.
Brave and with a very long-term outlook. All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much, Charles Ortel, Managing Director at Newport Value Partners.